They said no one would risk it, $5 million on the line, and a black horse so violent it had sent men to the hospital just by breathing too close. But when a broke war veteran stepped out of the crowd, scarred and hollow-eyed, the laughter died in every throat. He didn't just accept the challenge, he changed everything people thought they knew about fear, cruelty, and the fragile bond between man and beast. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. Dust Creek was the kind of town that looked like it had been forgotten by time. A cluster of weather-beaten buildings huddled against the wind, their paint long stripped by Wyoming's endless winters and summers of dust. Winters here were harsh, the kind where the wind cut through your coat like knives, rattling loose shutters until dawn. Summers were no better. Heat waves shimmered over cracked earth, and every gust of wind lifted a red haze of dirt that coated porches, teeth, and lungs. People in Dust Creek had grown used to surviving with grit and silence. Rodeos came in the spring, cattle drives in the fall, and the rhythm of ranch work tied the town together. But if there was one story every child in Dust Creek knew, it was the story of the Devil Horse. It lived in Donovan Hale's ranch on the edge of town, chained inside a rusting corral with links of iron as thick as a man's wrist. You could see it from the dirt road if you dared to linger. An enormous black stallion with a coat like cold dust and eyes that glinted red when the sun caught them. They said the horse had killed a handler years back, throwing him so hard into a fence post his spine snapped clean. Since then, no one had dared go near without a weapon in hand. The locals gave it a name whispered with both awe and fear: the Devil Horse. Whenever its scream tore through the night, high, sharp, and angry enough to curdle blood, Dust Creek went silent. Parents pulled children inside, shopkeepers froze mid-conversation, even drunks stumbled out of the bar, their laughter dying in their throats. The horse's cry felt like a curse. Kids were warned never to wander near Hale's corral, told stories that if they looked into its eyes too long, it would follow them home in their dreams. The corral itself became a scar on the town, a place you looked at only from a distance, a reminder of something violent, dangerous, and unspeakably wrong. Dust Creek had plenty of legends, but none as alive as the Devil Horse. Jack Harlow had lived in Dust Creek for nearly 3 years, though most of the town treated him like a ghost passing through. At 42, his body bore the marks of wars fought far from Wyoming. He had been a soldier in both Iraq and Afghanistan, discharged after too many years of desert heat, roadside bombs, and the kind of decisions that gnawed at you long after the fighting stopped. His hands were calloused from labor, his forearms lined with pale scars. A jagged welt curved across his ribs, the legacy of shrapnel he never talked about. But the wounds on the outside were nothing compared to the ones buried in his mind. Sleep had abandoned Jack long ago. He woke sweating in the night, breath ragged, ears ringing with phantom explosions. A sudden slam of a door, the crack of fireworks from the fairground, even a truck backfiring could send him sprawling for cover before he realized he was in Wyoming, not Fallujah. Sometimes neighbors swore they saw him running barefoot into the yard at midnight, shouting orders to men who weren't there. Jack didn't correct them. He didn't explain that it wasn't madness, just memory refusing to fade. He lived in a battered trailer on the outskirts of town, the kind you bought cheap from a scrapyard and prayed would last the winter. The roof leaked when the snow melted, the floor groaned with every step, and the heater coughed like a dying smoker. There was no place to raise a child, but it was all he had left. Once he'd received veterans' benefits, just enough to keep food on the table. But a clerical mistake, some lost paperwork, a box unchecked, a missed deadline, had cut him off. He had appealed, filled out forms, written letters, all denied. The system had decided he didn't qualify anymore, and that was that. Jack had stopped expecting help from anyone. The government had taken his youth and given him scars. Dust Creek had given him silence and suspicion. The only thing that kept him breathing was the boy asleep in the next room. Ethan. Ethan was 9 years old, though grief had aged him faster than most children. He was quiet in class, polite to teachers, and avoided playground scuffles. Other boys teased him, sometimes called his father crazy, called his home a shack, but Ethan endured it without a word. He had his mother's dark eyes, full of unspoken thoughts, and his father's stubborn jaw. Every night before he lay down on the thin mattress, Ethan pulled out a worn photograph of his mother. Anna Harlow's smile, caught forever in faded ink, was his treasure. She had been a nurse at the Dust Creek Clinic, known for her gentle hands and fierce laugh. Anna was gone now. She had been diagnosed with cancer 2 years earlier. The doctors said she needed surgery immediately, treatment after that. The cost, nearly $100,000. They didn't have health insurance. Jack had begged for help from the VA, from the state, from Hale himself, but every door slammed in his face. He'd sold Anna's car, sold his tools, even pawned his medals. It wasn't enough. She died in their trailer, in a bed that smelled of antiseptic and fear. Her last words to Jack weren't bitter, though he carried them like a knife in his chest. "Don't fight every battle, Jack. Take care of Ethan." Since then, Jack lived like a man clinging to a single promise. Ethan knew his father was haunted. He had seen him thrash in his sleep, heard him shout names of men Ethan had never met. Sometimes he would find Jack sitting at the table long after midnight, staring at nothing. Ethan would crawl into his lap and hold his father's rough hand until the shaking stopped. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He was the anchor Jack didn't know how to live without. It was on one of those dusky evenings, as father and son walked past Hale's sprawling ranch, that Jack first locked eyes with the devil horse. They were coming back from town, Ethan balancing a grocery bag in both arms, when the scream split the air. The sound knifed through Jack's skull, sharp and merciless. He staggered, knees buckling as if someone had detonated an IED nearby. The bag tumbled from Ethan's hands, cans rolling across the dirt road. Jack dropped to one knee, chest heaving, vision tunneling. For a moment, he wasn't in Dust Creek at all. He was back in Fallujah, smoke boiling, a comrade screaming, the smell of burning metal choking the air. "Dad!" Ethan cried, scrambling to his side. "It's just a horse, Dad." The boy's voice cut through the fog. Jack blinked hard, sweat dripping down his temple, and forced his eyes to focus. Through the rusted bars of the corral, the devil horse stared at him. The stallion's mane was tangled and wild, its chest heaving with each furious breath. Its eyes, dark as obsidian, locked onto Jack's with a force that felt almost human. For an instant, Jack swore he saw more than rage there. He saw pain. Not the kind of pain that came from fighting. Pain that came from being broken, scarred, left to rot. Jack's pulse slowed, his hand pressed against the ground to steady himself, Ethan's grip still tight on his arm. He couldn't look away from those eyes. In them, he recognized something he knew too well. The hollow stare of a creature that had been through hell and come back scarred, but unyielding. He whispered, though the boy barely heard it, "It's not just a horse." Ethan frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Jack didn't answer. He just stood, slowly brushed the dust from his jeans, and forced a shaky breath. The devil horse gave a final snort, then turned away into the shadows of its corral. But Jack carried that look with him long after they reached the trailer. That night, long after Ethan had fallen asleep, Jack sat at the table staring at the photo of Anna. Outside, the wind rattled the siding of the trailer, and somewhere in the distance, the devil horse screamed again. He didn't flinch this time. Instead, he whispered into the dark, "I know you." The auction hall at Hale Ranch smelled of dust, sweat, and hay. It was built from old pine beams, polished smooth by decades of rodeos, cattle auctions, and gatherings where fortunes were made and reputations destroyed. Flags from past rodeo championships fluttered along the rafters, sun-faded but still proud. And the floor creaked under the weight of boots and restless anticipation. That night, the place was packed tighter than anyone could remember. Ranch owners and weathered sons leaned against posts, chewing tobacco. Farmers came in from the edges of town, their shirts still dusty from the fields. Traders and horse buyers filled the benches, notebooks balanced on their knees. But the crowd wasn't there for cattle or tack. They were there for the legend chained just a few hundred yards outside, the devil horse. The murmur of the crowd was electric, a low current of nerves and gossip. "They say it broke another fence last week. Chain's the only thing holding that demon back. No one's fool enough to get close, not for all the money in the world." The words buzzed through the rafters as people shifted in their seats, pretending calm while their eyes betrayed unease. Even the local reporters, two young women from the Dust Creek Gazette, kept glancing toward the open windows as though the stallion might scream and shatter the glass. A handful of outsiders held up phones, already live streaming, eager to capture any spectacle worth clicks. The glow of their screens cast eerie blue lights across the rough-hewn walls. The tension gave the room the strange feel of a carnival and a funeral at once. It didn't take long for trouble to stir. Near the front, a knot of animal rights activists stood and raised their voices. They were outnumbered and out of place among the ranchers, but their indignation made them bold. "Why keep that animal chained?" a woman demanded, her voice cutting through the chatter. "It's torture. Years of cruelty just for Hale's pride." Others echoed her anger. "Free the horse, treat it humanely." All eyes turned to Donovan Hale. Hale was a man who thrived under attention. Dressed in a spotless white vest, bolo tie gleaming, he rose slowly from his seat at the head table. His hair was silvered at the temples, his boots shined to a mirror finish. He looked more like a senator than a rancher, and he wore that image like armor. He smiled, slow and deliberate, and raised one hand for quiet. "That horse," he said, his voice smooth as polished glass, "is no victim." He let the words hang before continuing. "It's a killer. Ask the family of the man it threw. Ask the doctors who stitched up the fools who thought they could break it." The crowd rustled, some nodding grimly, others muttering in doubt. "You think you can set it free?" Hale went on, spreading his arms. "Go ahead, see how long you last." Laughter erupted in pockets of the hall. A few men whistled. The activists hissed and jeered back, but their voices were swallowed by the louder tide of Hale's supporters. It wasn't a debate, it was a show, and Hale was the master of ceremonies. Then he delivered the line that would ricochet across the country. With a clap of his hands, he called for a microphone. His ranch manager hurried over, placing it in his palm. Hale held it like a preacher before a congregation, his grin sharp. $5 million, he announced, his voice booming off the rafters. 5 million to anyone who can ride that beast without being thrown. The hall exploded in laughter and shouts. "Easy money for your funeral," someone hollered. $5 million won't cover the hospital bill," another called. Phones shot into the air, recording, hashtags already sprouting across the internet. Devil Horse Challenge. Hale stood there, basking in the noise, confident no one would ever take him up on it. This was his kingdom, and the Devil Horse was his crown jewel, a terror no man could master, a legend that kept him feared and respected. No one moved, no one raised a hand. The crowd buzzed with expectation, but under it lay a certainty. No one was insane enough to try. A rancher leaned close to his wife, voice low. "That rich bastard just wants blood. He'd watch a man die and call it entertainment." The woman shook her head. "No one's stupid enough to volunteer. It's just a show." Behind them, a pack of young men laughed, miming the act of mounting a horse, then throwing themselves dramatically onto the floor. The crowd roared at their antics, the sound bouncing like thunder off the beams. The Devil Horse had become more than an animal. It was a spectacle, a punchline, a bet people whispered about with nervous laughter. The auction hall rang with mockery, with disbelief, with a certainty that no one would stand. And then Jack Harlow rose to his feet. At first, no one noticed. He had been sitting in the back, almost invisible in his faded jeans and worn jacket. But when he stepped into the aisle, the crowd's laughter faltered, then died. He was gaunt, his face weathered and hollow-eyed, dark circles carved beneath eyes that had seen too many deserts. His boots were scuffed, his hair touched with gray, his shoulders stooped, as though he carried a weight no one else could see. Gasps rippled through the benches. "Is that?" "It's Harlow, the vet with PTSD. The crazy one, the one living in that rusted trailer by the tracks." Murmurs swelled into a buzz as every head turned. Some smirked, waiting for him to make a fool of himself. Others shook their heads in pity. But no one expected what came next. Jack walked slowly down the aisle. He didn't fidget. He didn't waver. When he reached the open space near the front, he lifted his chin and spoke, his voice low but steady. "I'll take it." The words fell like stones into water. Silence spread outward in ripples. The auctioneer blinked, caught off guard. "Sir, are you sure?" His voice cracked with disbelief. Jack met his gaze. His voice was rough, but it carried. "I don't need the money," he said. "I need a future for my boy." Gasps broke the silence. From the corner, Ethan sat frozen, eyes wide, hands clutching the bench so hard his knuckles whitened. His face crumpled, and for a moment it looked like he might cry out. He couldn't believe what his father had just said. In the crowd, whispers turned dark. "He's lost his damn mind. Maybe he wants to die. Leave the boy the insurance payout. Fool suicide." But the cameras were already flashing, recording every word, every angle of Jack Harlow standing there like a man walking willingly into fire. Phone lines buzzed as reporters outside the hall began calling editors. Live stream numbers spiked. Dust Creek, the forgotten town, had just become the stage for a spectacle no one would look away from. And in the center of it stood Jack, unshaken, the weight of the whole hall pressing down on him. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. His declaration hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown at fate itself. It didn't take long for Dust Creek's secret to escape its borders. By the time the auction hall emptied, phones were already buzzing with notifications. Timelines filling with shaky footage of a gaunt man in faded denim standing up and declaring he would ride the devil horse. Within hours, the video spread across Wyoming, then beyond. Headlines screamed across screens like wildfire. "Veteran with PTSD accepts $5 million Devil Horse Challenge." On Twitter, the hashtags bloomed. Devil Horse Challenge, Nash and Crazy Vet, as Dust Creek. Within a day, they were trending statewide, and by evening they clawed their way onto national feeds. The Dust Creek Gazette ran its Sunday edition with a grainy photo of Jack Harlow, mid-sentence, Ethan visible in the background with wide, terrified eyes. The headline read, "Local Veteran Risks Life for Impossible Bet." Television anchors in Cheyenne replayed the clip in a loop, narrating the backstory with a half-amused, half-concerned tone they reserved for human interest oddities. They highlighted Ethan sitting frozen in the hall and framed it as a story both tragic and reckless. By the following morning, national outlets sniffed blood. Cable shows debated the ethics of Hale's wager. Talk radio hosts laughed about the cowboy kamikaze, while others lamented a broken system that leaves veterans desperate. Dust Creek had become a name the whole country suddenly knew. The responses online split like cracked glass. On one side were the mockers, comment sections filled with derision. PTSD vet looking for a quick death. 5 million? More like 5 seconds before he breaks his neck. Memes multiplied. Jack photoshopped in combat gear, astride a fire-breathing stallion, launched skyward with the caption, "Future Millionaire." Clips of rodeo clowns getting trampled were looped with his name plastered underneath. To thousands of strangers, he was a joke, the embodiment of reckless futility. But another current surged in parallel. Voices of sympathy rose, small at first, then louder. "He's not crazy," one woman wrote. "He's just a father trying to save his boy." Veterans forums lit up, men and women who knew what it meant to wake sweating in the night rallying around him. The Wyoming chapter of the American Legion released a statement demanding respect for Jack's courage. No one should mock a man standing up for his child. Then there were the spectators who felt nothing but curiosity. To them, Jack's fate was spectacle. Betting sites cropped up overnight, allowing wagers on how long he would last. Under 10 seconds. Under a minute. Survive or die. It was entertainment stripped of context, served to screens with popcorn and beer. In Dust Creek itself, the uproar bled into every corner. The Rusted Spur Bar had the video looping on its TV, customers shouting odds over the jukebox. The diner served up coffee with side orders of gossip. At the schoolyard, kids mimicked the devil horse's scream until teachers hushed them. No one could escape the story, least of all Jack and Ethan. Then came the government. 3 days after the auction, a letter arrived bearing the seal of the Wyoming Department of Child and Family Services. Jack unfolded it at his kitchen table, his hands trembling before he even read the words. The letter warned that should he be incapacitated or worse, Ethan could be placed in foster care for his own safety. The language was cold, legal, merciless. On television, a state official gave a clipped interview. This spectacle endangers not only a man, but also his child's stability. We have a duty to intervene if necessary. Lawyers from Cheyenne began sniffing around the story. Some offered to represent Jack pro bono if custody hearings came. Others whispered that Hale's influence would shield the event from interference. Hale himself leaned into the storm. He hired attorneys to frame the challenge as voluntary and lawful, brought in animal inspectors to nod approvingly at the corral, and declared publicly, "This event will be conducted under the highest standards of safety." The townsfolk knew better. Safety had nothing to do with it. Hale's word outweighed law in Dust Creek. He wanted the show, and he would get it. For Ethan, the storm was unbearable. The night after the letter came, he sat at the edge of the trailer's sagging couch, tears streaking his cheeks. His voice cracked as he shouted at his father, "Dad, why did you say yes? Do you want to die?" Jack sank to his knees in front of him, pulling the boy into his arms. His voice was low, shaky, the words almost choking him. "I lost your mum," he whispered. "I won't let them take you too." Ethan sobbed into his father's chest, clinging with the desperation of someone who feared the world was about to vanish. At school, things only worsened. A group of boys circled him during recess. "Your dad's going to be horse food," one sneered. "Better start packing for foster care." Ethan didn't fight. He didn't shout. He just lowered his head and walked away, shoulders rigid, retreating into silence. By the time he came home, he was hollow-eyed, clutching his mother's photo from Jack's wallet. She smiled at him in fading ink, and he whispered to her the words he couldn't say to anyone else. "Please don't let Dad die." At night, the trailer felt like another world. Dinner was canned beans and crackers under the dim glow of a single bulb. The heater rattled. The wind pressed against the walls. Father and son ate in silence, their shadows stretching long across peeling linoleum. In those moments, the gulf between them and the bright, cruel luxury of Donovan Hale's ranch felt wider than oceans. The weight of it all pressed hardest on Jack. Neighbors whispered when he passed. Some dropped off food at the trailer steps, quiet gestures of pity. Others crossed the street, not wanting to be associated with a crazy vet. Reporters camped near the gravel drive, pounding on the trailer door. Jack refused to answer. He kept the blinds drawn, the locks bolted, the silence heavy. But silence couldn't drown memory. At night he sat awake at the small table, Ethan asleep in the next room. He pulled out the papers he never stopped carrying. Anna's death certificate, the VA rejection letters, the medical bills with balances that had crushed him. He spread them out like scars, then stared at them until his vision blurred. Outside, the devil horse screamed, its cry mingling with phantom gunfire in his skull. He gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles burned, the room spinning with explosions only he could hear. For a moment, he thought he might break. The weight of mockery, the threat of losing Ethan, and the hollow gnaw of Anna's absence. It was too much for one man. But then he looked at the couch where Ethan slept, small and curled, his chest rising and falling in trust. The boy was his anchor, the only reason he hadn't drowned years ago. Jack closed his eyes, breathing slowly, forcing the war back into its cage. He whispered into the stillness, though no one could hear, "I won't let go. Not of him, not now." The press conference had been meant as routine damage control. Hale's handlers had planned it to reaffirm control, to present the challenge as little more than entertainment. But the air inside the community hall crackled with expectation as the cameras were readied, reporters crowding shoulder to shoulder, microphones thrust forward like bayonets. Jack Harlow stood at the front of the room, not beside Hale, but alone, framed by a simple banner that read, "Dust Creek Livestock Association." He looked as though he didn't belong there at all. His jacket frayed, boots scuffed, hair combed back without care. The fatigue around his eyes seemed carved into his face, yet when the first reporter called out, he raised his chin. "Mr. Harlow," a young woman from the Cheyenne Daily asked, her voice sharp, "do you have a plan? How do you intend to ride the devil horse?" The room fell into expectant silence. It was the question everyone wanted answered, and most expected nothing but vague bravado. Jack's voice was rough, but it carried. "I'll do it," he said, "but only if I'm allowed 7 days to watch the horse. No chains, no whips, and everything must be under official supervision. Gasps and murmurs broke instantly. The words rippled through the hall like a stone in water. Several reporters exchanged incredulous glances. Someone chuckled aloud. "You're setting terms now?" another journalist asked, barely suppressing laughter, a broke veteran dictating rules to Donovan Hale. Jack didn't flinch. His gaze swept across the faces, unblinking. "I don't fight blind battles anymore." He said nothing further, letting the words settle like dust after a storm. The reaction was swift and divided. In the crowd, scoffs echoed. "Who does he think he is, giving orders?" one rancher muttered. Another snorted, "The man's insane. You don't tell Hale what to do on his own land." But there were other voices, quieter but firm. "He's not crazy," a woman whispered to her neighbor. "He just wants it fair." On social media, the line caught fire. Live streams of the press conference captured Jack's declaration, and within minutes, the clip was shared and captioned, "No chains, no whips." By evening, it was a trending hashtag. No whips, no chains. Commentators on Twitter debated its meaning. Some dismissed it as empty rhetoric. Others hailed it as the first time anyone had challenged Hale, not only on the horse, but on the cruelty behind the legend. Opinion columns sprouted overnight with headlines like, "Is Dust Creek's Devil Horse the victim?" and "One man's stand against a system of fear." For once, Jack wasn't just a punchline, he was a question mark. Donovan Hale did not enjoy questions. He entered the room later that day, flanked by Cole Branson, his foreman, whose scarred hands and crooked grin had kept ranch hands trembling for years. Hale's usual swagger faltered as he saw the expectant faces of dozens of reporters and the battery of cameras aimed squarely at him. Branson leaned close, whispering harshly, "Don't give in, boss. Crush him." But Hale could read the room. The reporters weren't just locals anymore. National networks had sent their people, men and women, who would broadcast every word to millions. He knew if he refused outright, it would smell like cowardice. If he admitted weakness, his empire of intimidation would crack. So he smiled, thin, brittle, and leaned into the microphone. "Fine," he said, his voice carrying that old drawl, but sharper than usual. 7 days. Let the soldier play his little game. The beast will kill him anyway." The room erupted into noise, shouts, laughter, applause. Some cheered, taking Hale's words as a promise of spectacle. Others murmured in surprise that he had agreed at all. The activists in the corner pumped fists, whispering that maybe, just maybe, change was possible. Hale sat back, jaw tight, his smile stiff. He had been cornered into granting terms he despised, but his pride allowed no retreat. Better to gamble the devil horse would do what chains and whips had always ensured: destroy whoever dared approach. From that moment, the challenge transformed. It was no longer just a drunken dare shouted in an auction hall. It became a national event with its own name, the $5 million challenge. Newspapers adopted it instantly. Television anchors repeated it with relish. By nightfall, it appeared on tickers beneath stock prices and weather updates. Every network wanted a piece of it. CNN aired a segment featuring a veterinarian who insisted the stallion's aggression was conditioned by abuse, not nature. Fox invited a panel of rodeo champions, most of whom smirked and predicted Jack would last about as long as a cowboy at his first bull ride. MSNBC called in a psychologist who grimly explained PTSD and questioned whether Jack was being exploited. Talk shows debated whether he was brave or delusional. Late-night comedians joked about Wyoming becoming the new Roman Colosseum. Online, the betting exploded. Apps offered odds down to the second. 10 seconds before Jack was thrown, 30 before he broke his neck. Millions of dollars shifted hands before the event even began. And through it all, the world's eyes turned toward a tiny Wyoming town most had never heard of. Dust Creek, population barely 2,000, was now the epicenter of a national storm. Jack Harlow's name, once spoken only in whispers at the grocery store, was suddenly on every tongue. And the devil horse screamed in its corral, as if it too sensed the world waiting. The morning air over Dust Creek carried a strange weight, as though the whole town was holding its breath. For the first time in years, the gates of the devil horse's corral were unlocked, not for a handler with a whip or a vet with a tranquilizer, but for a man who had nothing but a battered notebook and a pencil in his hand. Jack Harlow walked slowly toward the rusted fence line. Reporters jostled for space, police officers leaned against squad cars to keep order, and Hale's ranch hands clustered nearby with wary eyes. The corral had been cleared of chains, except the one that held the stallion to the central post, its links thick with rust and scars from years of strain. The horse pawed the ground, muscles coiled like springs, as if sensing something new in the air. Jack wore no cowboy hat, no spurs, no gear. Just a faded shirt tucked into old jeans, his boots scuffed from years of labor. In one pocket, a pencil stub. In the other, a small spiral notebook. He had no rope, no whip, no weapon. The crowd buzzed with expectation, a mixture of jeers and whispered prayers. When the latch clanged open and the corral door creaked aside, the stallion erupted. Its scream tore through the morning like shrapnel. Jack froze mid-step, his body jolting as though an IED had detonated yards away. His vision blurred, sudden flares of orange, the phantom crack of gunfire, dust storms rising from a desert half a world away. He staggered, clutching his chest, the old war clawing him back into its grip. Gasps swept through the crowd. Someone laughed harshly. The soldiers already scared to death. But Jack did not run. He dropped to one knee, forced his breathing into slow, deliberate pulls, eyes lowered to the dirt instead of meeting the horse's gaze head-on. His hands trembled on his thighs until the rhythm steadied. He stayed that way. Minutes passed, then hours. The horse circled, restless, testing the length of its chain. It stomped, snorted, tossed its head, daring the man to make a move. But Jack never rose. He scribbled notes in his book. The cadence of its breathing, the twitch of its ears, the timing between its stomps. When the sun began to dip, Jack finally closed the notebook and whispered to himself, "Not rage, not yet." What he had seen was something subtler, a limp in the hind leg, the way the stallion shifted weight to the right side, scars of an old injury. He left the corral without fanfare, but the crowd left buzzing with divided voices. That night, the headlines wrote themselves, "Veteran spends hours staring at horse." No contact made. On talk radio, callers snickered. He's just too scared to go near it. Social media roasted him with looping clips of him kneeling, the caption, "Meditation won't save you, soldier." But not everyone mocked. A new hashtag caught traction. Yichi Silent Soldier. The image of Jack sitting alone in the dirt while the devil horse circled had a strange pull. Some called it weakness, others saw restraint. A woman on Facebook wrote, "He's not fighting, he's listening." A blog compared him to a mythical horse whisperer. The notion spread. For the first time, Jack's silence became louder than Hale's spectacle. Day 2 drew an even bigger crowd. Trucks lined the dirt road, people leaning against hoods holding phones aloft. Reporters clustered so tightly against the fence they had to be pushed back by deputies. Because today, the chains would be cut. At Jack's insistence, the horse would be freed of the iron that had bound it for years. When the bolt cutters snapped through the first link, the stallion exploded. It lunged skyward, hooves slicing the air, body twisting in fury. The ground thundered beneath its stomps, dust rising in violent clouds. People screamed, some stumbling backward from the fence as the horse lashed its hind legs in deadly arcs. Ethan stood pressed against the barrier, his face pale, fists clenched at his sides. Every instinct told him to run to his father, but Sarah Whitman, the veterinarian, gripped his shoulder. "Stay here," she hissed. "Don't move." The corral became chaos incarnate. The horse galloped in circles, crashing against the rails, sweat already soaking its black coat. Its scream rattled the bones of everyone present. Bets flew through the crowd. 10 seconds before he bolts, 30 before it kills him. But Jack did not move. He sat cross-legged in the dust, eyes tracking the animal with a soldier's calm. His pulse thundered in his ears, but he remembered the training. When chaos breaks loose, survival belongs to the one who keeps still enough to see. 30 minutes dragged by. The stallion's fury burned itself ragged. Foam flecked its mouth, its chest heaved like bellows, and then, as though confused, it slowed. It stopped a dozen yards away, sides quivering, steam rising from its body. Jack lowered his head, pencil scratching across paper. Not anger, pain and fear. On the far side of the fence, Branson spat into the dirt, sneering loud enough for cameras to catch. The vet's just waiting for the beast to kill itself for him. But others leaned forward, captivated. Something was shifting. That night, Jack returned to the trailer, body heavy as stone. His hands trembled so badly he dropped his pencil twice before setting it down. Ethan hovered close, watching him with wide, worried eyes. "Dad, were you scared?" Jack managed a crooked smile. "Every second, but fear keeps me alive." They ate canned soup at the small table, the silence broken only by the hum of the heater. Jack went to bed early, but sleep offered no mercy. In his dreams, he was back in Iraq, a squad cutting chains from prisoners in a desert compound. The sudden eruption of chaos, men screaming, flashes of fire, the metallic shriek of terror, and over it all, the shrill cry of a horse. He woke drenched in sweat, chest heaving, gasping as though smoke filled his lungs. Ethan was there, as always, sliding an arm around his father's shoulders, whispering, "It's okay, Dad. You're home." For a moment, Jack believed him. By dawn, the story had spread further than even Hale expected. Devil horse unchained, veteran stays calm. Clips of Jack sitting motionless while the stallion tore circles around him drew millions of views. The hashtags multiplied. Jack Unchained, Gene Devil v Silent Soldier. Commentators began to waver. One New York paper asked, maybe this isn't madness, maybe it's patience. In the quiet of his trailer, Jack sat with his notes, Ethan still asleep, and let the words echo in his mind. Patience, not conquest. It was a beginning. The third morning dawned under a slate-grey sky, clouds drifting low, as if the heavens themselves had gathered to watch. The corral was louder than ever. The bleachers Hale had ordered built were already filled. Ranchers in wide-brimmed hats, locals clutching styrofoam cups of coffee, reporters with cameras balanced on their shoulders. When Cole Branson appeared at the gate, the crowd erupted in whistles and applause. Branson was a man built of sinew and cruelty, Hale's right hand for a decade. He wore his leather vest like armor, boots clicking with measured rhythm, and around his wrist hung a coiled whip, its handle polished from years of use. His grin was a slash across his face as he strode into the corral like a showman entering a ring. The stallion's reaction was instant. The devil horse screamed, its voice a jagged blade ripping across the crowd. Its eyes went white, head thrashing violently, hooves striking the ground with the desperate rhythm of panic. Foam flecked its mouth as it swung its massive body against the fence. The sound of muscle and iron colliding with wood reverberated like cannon fire. The audience cheered as though this were part of the entertainment. "That's the devil we know," someone shouted, but Jack, standing outside the fence line with his notebook clutched in trembling fingers, felt his chest cave in. His hands shook, not with fear of the horse, but with recognition. The stallion's every spasm mirrored the way his own body seized when fireworks cracked overhead or when a car backfired too close. He could feel his pulse hammering in his throat, memory colliding with reality. The animal wasn't showing rage, it was showing terror. He pressed the pencil hard against the paper, scribbling through the blur in his eyes. Not aggression. Trauma response. The crowd laughed, pointing at the spectacle. But Jack knew the truth. This wasn't a beast born mean. This was a creature haunted by ghosts, just as he was. That night, long after the crowd had gone home, Jack sat in the cramped office of Dust Creek's lone veterinarian, Dr. Sarah Whitman. The desk lamp glowed warm against the cool night air, casting long shadows over stacks of medical charts. Sarah, her hair pulled back in a loose braid, slid a worn folder across the desk. "You need to see this," she said. Jack opened it with care. Inside were photographs, grainy, harsh, undeniable. The first showed the stallion at a rodeo 3 years ago, its mouth bloodied by a cruel bit of iron forced between its teeth. Another revealed long red welts streaking its flank, raw from the lash of a whip. And then came the one that made Jack's stomach twist. Branson, captured mid-swing, whip raised high, his face contorted with fury. In the background, seated in the stands, Donovan Hale watched with a tumbler of whiskey in his hand, grinning as though violence were sport. Jack's breath caught. His hand clenched the photo so hard the edges cut his skin. Sarah's voice was quiet, deliberate. "It wasn't born a monster, Jack. Men made it one, same as war makes soldiers." The room tilted. Suddenly, Jack was not in the clinic, but back overseas. He saw soldiers towering over bound prisoners, boots slamming against ribs. He smelled the sharp stench of fire from a roadside bomb. He heard the screaming, the laughter, the indifference. The photo shook in his hands. He knew with a clarity that hollowed him out that the devil horse was not his enemy. It was his reflection. Later in the trailer, Jack sat alone at the small table, the photos spread like evidence of a crime. His fingers trembled as he stared at them, the images pulsing like wounds in the dim light. His mind drifted to Anna, her frail body in that sagging bed, her hand gripping his as she whispered her last plea, "Don't fight every battle, Jack. Take care of Ethan." He had been powerless then, denied by bureaucrats and systems too cold to care. He had lost her because money outweighed mercy. And now he saw it again. The same system that chained a horse and called it entertainment, that mocked a veteran and called it madness. He looked at Ethan, asleep on the worn couch, his chest rising and falling with the innocence of dreams. Jack reached out and brushed a hand over the boy's hair, whispering into the quiet, "We're not the only ones, buddy. That horse, it's broken, just like us." The boy stirred but didn't wake. Jack sat back, eyes burning. The realization felt both like a burden and a bond. Day 4 brought a new kind of tension. Jack walked into the corral, carrying not just his notebook, but the folder Sarah had given him. The crowd buzzed louder than ever, eager for spectacle, their phones lifted like lighters at a concert. He stood in the dust, lifted the photographs, and held them high. "This horse," he called out, his voice ragged but strong, "is not a monster. It's a victim. Look at what was done to it." The reaction was chaos. Some in the crowd gasped, leaning forward to see. Others shouted, "Fake! Lies!" The noise rose, a storm of disbelief and outrage. Before Jack could continue, Branson stormed into the corral. His boots struck like hammer blows as he crossed the distance in a fury. Without a word, he snatched the photos from Jack's hands, tore them into jagged scraps, and flung them into the dirt. "Enough of your games, soldier!" He spat, his face red, his body trembling with rage. Jack stood still, his chest heaving. He didn't strike back. His fists clenched at his sides, but he kept them down, his eyes burning with a fury colder than Branson's heat. The stallion screamed from across the corral, thrashing as though it, too, felt the violence in the air. The crowd erupted, some jeering, others shouting in defense of Jack. But the cameras had seen everything. Dozens of reporters had caught the moment Branson ripped the evidence to pieces, his snarl framed against Jack's silent defiance. Within hours, the footage spread like wildfire. "Foreman destroys abuse evidence." The caption ran across screens from Wyoming to Washington. The clip flooded Twitter feeds, spawning a new hashtag. "Who is the monster?" Comment threads boiled with anger. For the first time, the world questioned not Jack's sanity, but Hale's cruelty. Maybe, people wrote, the devil horse wasn't a demon. Maybe it was a victim, and Hale had built his empire on its suffering. By evening, the story had shifted entirely. Major outlets published headlines like, "Is the devil horse a victim of cruelty?" Photos of the stallion's scars circulated alongside Sarah's veterinary notes, leaked by activists who had been waiting for proof. Outside Hale's ranch gates, protesters gathered with signs, "Free the devil horse. Stop the abuse." Dust Creek had never seen a demonstration before. Now it swarmed with voices demanding justice. At school, Ethan braced himself for ridicule, but the tide had turned. Instead of sneers, one boy muttered almost grudgingly, "Your dad's fighting for that horse." Another whispered, "It's crazy, but maybe he's right." Ethan carried those words home like a fragile gift. For once, his father wasn't just the town's broken veteran, he was something more. And as Jack sat that night with Ethan curled against his side, he felt the shift too. The laughter hadn't vanished, but it had been drowned out by something stronger. For the first time, he wasn't just fighting for himself, he was standing for the truth. The fifth morning broke crisp and clear, sunlight pouring across the corral like molten gold. Dust Creek was awake early. People streamed down dirt roads, cars parked haphazardly in fields, children perched on fence rails. By now, the spectacle had become a daily ritual. The whole town and half the state by live stream waited to see what the broken veteran would do next. Reporters pressed microphones against the fence line. "Maybe today he'll finally try to touch it," one murmured. Another scoffed. "Or maybe he'll just sit there again. Man's got the easiest $5 million job in history." Jack walked through the gate without fanfare, the gravel crunching under his boots. He carried nothing but his notebook and pencil. His posture was stooped, yet steady. He moved to the center of the corral and lowered himself into the dirt, crossing his legs like a monk preparing for meditation. He closed his eyes, exhaled slowly, and fixed his gaze on the ground. The stallion's scream split the air. It charged in a wide arc, hooves hammering like drums. Dust spiraled around it as it circled, ears pinned back, teeth bared. The crowd erupted in whistles and nervous laughter, but Jack didn't flinch. He sat in silence, breathing evenly, his presence as still as stone. Minutes stretched into an hour. The horse's frenzy gradually ebbed, its circles tightening until it stood 20 feet away. Its ears twitched toward him, its head dipped an inch, uncertain. The crowd grew restless. "Do something!" someone shouted. "Move, damn it!" Whistles of derision carried across the corral, but a few journalists leaned forward, noting the detail others missed. The horse had stopped. It was no longer raging blindly, it was watching. On the other side of the fence, Ethan clung to the wood, his eyes wide but glowing with a kind of recognition. He understood in a way the adults didn't. His father wasn't waiting to act. He was waiting to be approached. By late afternoon, the first fragile signs of trust appeared. The devil horse, sides glistening with sweat, shuffled closer. Jack remained seated, his breath steady, his head lowered to keep from provoking. The stallion snorted, closing the distance to 10 feet. Its nostrils flared, drawing in the scent of the man in the dirt. Jack neither moved nor raised his eyes. He simply let his heart slow, syncing his breath with the rhythm of the animals. After a long suspended moment, the horse turned away. Not in fury, but in something quieter. Curiosity. Jack scribbled the words in his notebook. Not fear. Curiosity. It was the first time the devil horse had shown anything beyond rage. And though the crowd left muttering about wasted hours, Jack knew something had shifted. But peace in Dust Creek never lasted long. That night, while the town slept, Cole Branson slipped through the shadows toward the corral. The moon painted his face in stark relief, his jaw tight, his grip clenched around the coiled whip in his hand. Hatred burned in his eyes as he climbed over the fence. He snapped the whip once against the dirt. The crack echoed like gunfire. The stallion went berserk. It reared, foam flying from its mouth, eyes rolling red with terror. It slammed into the rails, splintering wood, blood streaking down its flanks as panic drove it mad. Branson struck again, the sound slicing through the night. "You'll never bend," he snarled. "And neither will that fool of a soldier." Phones lit up in the distance, neighbors woken by the racket recording from porches and parked trucks. Inside his trailer, Jack jerked awake. The sound wasn't a whip in his mind. It was artillery, the crack of rifles, the shriek of rockets. His chest heaved as he stumbled into the night, barefoot, heart pounding like a drum. For a breathless instant, he thought he was back in Fallujah. But then he saw the corral, the stallion thrashing in terror, and Branson, whip raised high. Jack vaulted the fence without thinking. Sweat poured down his temples, his ears ringing, vision swimming with overlapping ghosts, Branson's form merging with memories of soldiers beating prisoners, with images of men cowering under leather and steel. His body convulsed with a sick dizziness of trauma, but his feet kept moving. He stepped between Branson and the horse. The stallion reared behind him, hooves crashing inches from his head, but Jack raised his arms wide, shielding it with his thin, shaking frame. His voice tore from his throat, raw and furious. "That's enough," Branson sneered, his whip coiled for another strike. "Move, soldier," he spat, "or you'll get the same treatment." Jack's breath rattled, his knees threatened to buckle, but he didn't move. He planted his boots in the dirt and stared the man down. Under the glare of headlights from trucks parked nearby, his gaunt figure cut a defiant silhouette, a scarecrow of scars refusing to bend. The horse screamed behind him, but for once it did not attack. It stood pressed close, its trembling body seeking shelter in the space Jack's stance carved against violence. The next morning, the internet burned with the footage. A teenager's shaky phone video showed the scene in grainy light. Branson swinging the whip, Jack stepping in front of the raging horse, arms outstretched. The caption, "Veteran protects horse from abuser." Within hours it had millions of views. Hashtags bloomed. Stand with Jack. Broken, not beast. News anchors replayed the clip endlessly, commentators marveling at the symbolism. The man with PTSD shielding a terrified animal. "It's not just about a horse anymore," one analyst said. "It's about cruelty, trauma, and resilience." Petitions flooded online demanding Branson's firing and an investigation into Hale Ranch. Activists gathered at the gates with banners, their chants echoing into town. For the first time, the tide had truly turned. Jack was no longer a joke. He was a hero. That evening, when the chaos died down and Branson had been dragged off the ranch in disgrace, Jack collapsed in the dirt of the corral. His body shook with exhaustion, sweat soaking his shirt. He pressed his palms against the ground, willing the tremors in his chest to slow. The devil horse stood a few yards away, sides still heaving, but its eyes were different. No longer wild with hatred. Just tired. Just wary. It let out a long, guttural sigh, the sound less a threat than a release. Jack closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his lids, he heard Anna's voice, clear as the night she left him. "Don't fight everything. Learn to listen." He whispered into the air, voice cracking, "I'm listening now." The horse didn't move, but it didn't flee either. Later that night, Ethan crawled into bed beside his father, wrapping his small arms around Jack's chest. For the first time in months, Jack slept without dreams of war. Instead, he dreamed only of a great black horse breathing in the dark, its sigh mingling with his own. The sun rose hard and bright over Dust Creek, turning the Wyoming dust into fire. By mid-morning, the town had swelled far beyond its borders. Thousands lined the roads, parking fields turned to seas of cars and trucks. Satellite vans jammed the main street, reporters shouting into cameras while technicians wrestled with cables, and drones hummed overhead like mechanical hornets. It felt less like a ranch and more like an arena. The bleachers built along Hale's fence overflowed with bodies, voices buzzing like a hive. Some had traveled hundreds of miles, lured by the promise of spectacle, to see either the impossible miracle of a broken horse tamed or the inevitable disaster of a broken soldier destroyed. Ethan pressed himself against the fence, his knuckles white as he clutched the worn wood. His small frame shook with nerves, his eyes never leaving the corral. Sarah Whitman stood beside him, her arms folded tight, her jaw set. She scanned the scene with a doctor's eye, taking in every twitch of the stallion's body from across the rail. Hale sat higher up in the stands, dressed in his immaculate white vest, his hands clasped on his cane. His face wore that half-smile that never reached his eyes. And though Branson had been disgraced in the public eye, he stood just behind Hale like a shadow, jaw clenched, daring the soldier to fail. The air was electric, humming with tension, every breath the crowd took, drawn tight by anticipation. This was the seventh day, the last chance. The corral gate creaked open, and Jack Harlow stepped through. He carried nothing in his hands, no rope, no bit, no weapon. Only the dust clinging to his boots and the fatigue of a week carved into his face. He moved slowly, each step measured, deliberate, like a man approaching an altar. When he reached the center, he stopped, pulled off his battered hat, and let his shoulders sag. Then, with deliberate humility, he lowered his head below the stallion's line of sight. It was the posture of surrender, the language of prey rather than predator. The crowd erupted in noise. "What's he doing?" someone jeered. "Looks like he's giving up." Laughter rolled across the stands, but a few journalists scribbled furiously in notebooks, their voices hushed with realization. "No," one whispered, "he's not surrendering, he's inviting." Jack didn't look at them. His gaze stayed low, his body loose, as if he were laying down every weapon, every shield. The soldier had not come to conquer, he had come to ask. The devil horse's scream ripped through the corral, a sound of fury sharpened by years of chains. Its muscles bunched, hooves pounding against the dirt, ears pinned back in violent warning. The ground quaked with its stamping. Ethan's chest seized. He grabbed Sarah's hand, holding it so tight his nails dug into her skin. She didn't pull away. For a heartbeat, it seemed inevitable that the beast would charge, that Jack would be crushed before the world's eyes, that the promise of $5 million would end in blood. But then something shifted. The stallion's breath came ragged and harsh, its sides heaving, its nostrils wide. Slowly, almost grudgingly, its head dropped a few inches. Its ears flicked forward, then back, uncertain, before settling toward Jack. Its tail swished once in agitation, then stilled. It wasn't submission. Not yet. But it wasn't an attack either. The crowd, sensing the change, fell silent. The laughter drained away, replaced by a hush so heavy it pressed against the corral walls. Even Hale leaned forward, his smirk faltering. Jack lowered himself to his knees, dust clinging to his jeans. He extended one hand, palm open, calloused fingers spread wide. He did not reach for the horse. He left the space between them intact, his hand hovering in the air, just close enough for the stallion to choose. The animal's breath rumbled like distant thunder. Step by step, it closed the gap, its hooves sinking into the dirt. The air grew thick with the sound of its breathing and the smell of sweat and earth rolling off its massive body. At last, the stallion's muzzle hovered inches from Jack's hand. Its nostrils flared, pulling in his scent, warm air streaming across his skin. Jack closed his eyes, exhaling with a shiver that seemed to leave his bones hollow. He whispered, barely audible, but caught on microphones straining in the silence, "It's okay. I'm broken too." The horse huffed, the sound almost like an answer. For a moment, the corral froze. Time itself seemed to pause. The dust held its breath. Even the wind quieted, as though unwilling to disturb the fragile thread that bound the two survivors together. A man and a beast, neither tamed, neither whole, meeting not in conquest, but in recognition. The cameras captured everything. Every network in America had their lenses trained on that dirt corral. And the image seared itself instantly into broadcast history. A scarred veteran on his knees, eyes closed, hand open. A scarred horse bending close, their breaths mingling in the space between. The feeds exploded. Anchor desks froze mid-sentence as producers shouted into earpieces. Twitter blazed alive within seconds. Veteran and horse, eye to eye. The clip ricocheted across platforms, shared with captions like "Not Madness." Healing. Hashtags surged. Eye to eye. Silent bond, broken together. Viewers wept openly in living rooms, in office cubicles, in classrooms where teachers forgot their lessons to show the live stream. Soldiers messaged forums, "That's us, that's every one of us." Animal welfare groups hailed it as proof that cruelty, not nature, had created the monster. Even those who had mocked fell silent, because what they had witnessed was undeniable, two broken souls finding each other in the dust. The dawn of the seventh day did not feel like Dust Creek anymore. The sleepy Wyoming town had been swallowed by something larger than itself, an empire of cameras, cables, and voices. By sunrise, satellite trucks stretched down both sides of Main Street, their dishes aimed skyward like a forest of steel. Crews from CNN, Fox, the Associated Press, and half a dozen foreign outlets jostled for space on the dirt roads. Makeshift tents sprouted like weeds, anchormen sat under portable lights, makeup powdered onto their cheeks. And every few minutes, a drone buzzed overhead to capture sweeping shots of the corral. Inside the bars and diners, televisions glowed from every corner. Bartenders turned up the volume. Waitresses stopped carrying plates to lean against counters, and ranchers who had never cared for social media crowded around screens that streamed the event in real time. The betting markets had grown obscene overnight. Apps offered odds not only on whether Jack Harlow would ride the horse, but on how long before he was thrown. 5 seconds tops, one gambler muttered. Another bet on whether the horse would kill him outright. The money swirled like a river, millions changing hands before Jack had even set foot in the corral. At the fence, Ethan clung to the rail, his nails biting into the wood. His heart drummed so hard he could hear it in his ears. Sarah Whitman stood at his side, her presence steady as stone, though her lips moved in quiet murmurs only Ethan could hear. "Trust him," she whispered. "He knows what he's doing." Then Hale stepped onto the temporary grandstand, his tailored vest gleaming, a microphone clenched in his manicured hand. He smiled with the practiced ease of a showman. But the cameras caught the tightness around his eyes. "This," he declared, his voice booming across the speakers, "is where the fool dies." Laughter cascaded from parts of the crowd, but those watching closely noticed the momentary twitch at the corner of his mouth, the slip of a man who suddenly wasn't so sure. The hinges screamed as the corral gate swung open. The devil horse erupted like a storm breaking free. Black muscle coiled into motion, its hooves striking the earth in thunderous rhythm. Dust exploded beneath its charge, the ground trembling under its weight. Its scream ripped through the morning, raw and violent, the sound of a creature forged in pain. Gasps tore from the crowd. A woman covered her child's eyes. Men shouted warnings, certain they were about to witness a death broadcast live to the nation. But Jack Harlow did not move. He stood in the center of the corral, eyes closed, his breath deep and deliberate. The years of panic attacks, the therapy sessions, the late-night battles with shadows. Every tool he had ever learned to fight PTSD was now drawn upon. Inhale, exhale, slow, controlled. The stallion bore down on him like a locomotive. The dust enveloped him, the ground shaking, the beast's eyes white with fury, and then, just steps away, the devil horse stopped. It slammed a hoof into the dirt, the sound cracking like a rifle shot. It tossed its head, nostrils flaring, chest heaving, sweat darkening its coat. The crowd froze, breath held. Jack opened his eyes. He met the animal's gaze and did not blink. For a heartbeat, two survivors locked eyes, one forged by war, the other by whips and chains. Neither looked away. The silence was unbearable. Thousands of people held still. Cameras zoomed, lenses tightening on every twitch of muscle, every flicker of breath. It was no longer a soldier and a beast. It was a reckoning. Jack raised his hand, not to strike, not to control, just to offer. His palm hovered inches from the stallion's muzzle. The horse snorted, flaring hot breath across his fingers. It stamped once, shaking its mane, but did not retreat. Slowly, Jack leaned forward until his shoulder brushed the animal's neck. The gasp that rippled through the bleachers was almost physical. 1,000 people inhaled as one. Jack's hand gripped the coarse black mane. His body moved carefully, deliberately, as though the very air might shatter if he rushed. In one slow motion, he pulled himself upward and swung a leg across. For the first time in history, a man sat astride the devil horse. The stallion threw its head once, testing the weight, but it did not buck. It stood, sides heaving, chest alive with power. Jack sat straight, his back quivering with the effort to hold steady, but he did not command, did not force. He merely breathed, syncing his rhythm with the beast beneath him. 5 seconds passed, then 10, then more. It was enough, enough for the cameras, for the witnesses, for the world to see the impossible had been done. Jack slid off the side, landing lightly in the dust. He had not conquered the horse. He had simply joined it for a moment. For several seconds, the world didn't move. The bleachers, the field, the entire town held in suspended silence. The only sound was the harsh, heavy breathing of the devil horse and the whisper of the Wyoming wind. Ethan's hands flew to his face. Tears burst down his cheeks as he whispered, "He did it. He really did it." Sarah's hand pressed firmly on his shoulder, her voice thick but steady. "Yes, he did." And then, from somewhere in the stands, a single voice rang out. "He rode it." The words detonated. The silence shattered into a roar. The crowd surged to its feet, fists punching the sky, shouts crashing like waves. "He rode it! He rode it!" The chant rolled outward from the bleachers to the streets, echoing through every bar where screens flickered, through every phone streaming the feed, through living rooms and offices across the country. The noise was deafening. A tidal wave of disbelief turned into celebration. Reporters shoved against the fence, cameras swung wildly, microphones crackled with chaos. Online, the live stream hit records within minutes, millions of people watching the clip replay on a loop. Jack stood in the dust, his chest rising and falling, eyes lowered as though the storm around him didn't exist. For once, he allowed himself a small smile. The reactions came in floods. In Dust Creek, neighbors who had once mocked Jack hugged each other, tears streaking their faces. Strangers sobbed openly. Children climbed fences shouting his name. On social media, hashtags detonated like fireworks. He rode it. Shatara 5 million challenge. Silent soldier. The clip of Jack sitting on the horse for those fleeting, eternal seconds became an instant icon, plastered across screens worldwide. Commentators on every network scrambled for words. "It's not just a ride," one said. "It's a parable. A man with scars chose patience over violence, and the world saw." In the VIP box, Donovan Hale's smile curdled. His face flushed purple, the applause around him a dagger to his pride. He clapped once, twice, stiff and forced, but his eyes smoldered with rage. This had been meant to humiliate, to prove his dominance. Instead, it had turned on him, exposing his empire to scrutiny. Beside him, Branson seethed, his fists clenched, his jaw grinding so hard it looked ready to shatter. He took a step toward the corral, but a wall of cameras and security blocked him. He was no longer feared. He was contained. At the fence, Ethan tore from Sarah's side and shouted, voice cracking but joyous, "Dad!" Jack looked up. For the first time in years, he smiled wide enough for the world to see. He raised a hand and waved. In that moment, the man who had been Dust Creek's broken veteran was something else entirely. He was proof. Proof that monsters weren't born, they were made, and that even the broken could still rise. The roar of the crowd still thundered across Dust Creek, chants of, he rode it," shaking the wooden bleachers. Reporters were screaming into their cameras, social media feeds exploded, and for the first time in living memory, hope seemed to outweigh cruelty. But not for Cole Branson. His face twisted into something feral, veins bulging at his temples as the chants rattled through him like nails on glass. He shoved through the crowd, shoulders battering against startled spectators, until he reached the fence. "No!" he roared, his voice breaking with rage. "That beast will never be tamed. I'll end it now." A guard stepped in his path, but Branson ripped a wooden baton straight from the man's belt. His knuckles whitened around it, his eyes bloodshot with fury. Before anyone could stop him, he vaulted the fence and stormed into the corral. The cheers faltered into gasps. Mothers pulled their children close. Men shouted warnings. The devil horse flared in alarm, the whites of its eyes flashing, hooves slamming against the dirt. It screamed, confusion and terror crackling through the air as Branson advanced, swinging the baton like a weapon meant not to threaten, but to kill. Jack moved without thinking. His body was still trembling from the ride, exhaustion weighing on his limbs, but instinct carried him forward. He stepped directly into Branson's path, planting himself between the raging foreman and the animal behind him. His chest heaved, his face pale, but his voice cut through the corral with clarity, amplified by every microphone and every live feed. "You've hurt it enough," he said, each word steady as steel. "Over my dead body." The crowd erupted, some screaming in horror, others in awe. Phones lifted high, capturing the moment in 100 shaky frames. The horse shrieked, but did not bolt. Instead, it pressed closer, standing just behind Jack, as though his scarred body were a shield. Its breath poured hot against his back, and for the first time the devil horse seemed to understand where safety stood. Branson sneered, spit flying. "Move, soldier. You're nothing but a broken wreck. Get out of my way." But Jack did not move, his boots rooted into the dust, his gaze unwavering, every ounce of his being poured into that line in the sand. Dozens of cameras captured it all, the gaunt silhouette of a veteran, chest heaving, squaring off against a man swollen with rage and armed with a club. Across the country, screens lit with the moment. On Twitter, hashtags flared alive. "Over my dead body, just protect the vet. Stop the abuse." Comments poured into live broadcasts. "He's standing for all of us. Don't let that bastard near the horse. Protect the soldier, protect the animal." And in the stands at Dust Creek, the chant began, low and uncertain. "Stop him! Stop him!" It grew louder, swelling like a tide. "Stop him! Stop him!" The chant shook the air, carried by thousands of throats, the cry of a people who had seen enough cruelty to last a lifetime. On the VIP platform, Donovan Hale sat frozen. His complexion had drained to chalk. He knew what the cameras were showing. His foreman, his right hand, caught in front of the nation as the embodiment of brutality. If Branson struck now, Hale's empire would crumble before the blow even landed. The weight of millions of eyes pressed down. The pressure of every news feed, every trending hashtag, every shouted demand from the crowd left him cornered. Finally he rose, his voice cracking, not with authority but with panic. "Enough, Cole, drop it." The words boomed through the speakers, echoing across the corral. Branson froze mid-stride, his eyes bulged. Betrayal etched deep, as though Hale had stabbed him. The baton slipped from his grasp, clattering into the dirt. Two security guards pounced, seizing his arms, wrenching him backward as he thrashed and cursed. The crowd howled, a storm of boos and whistles raining down as they dragged him toward the gate. Branson's voice cracked with fury. "You're all blind. That horse will kill you all." But his words vanished beneath the thunder of outrage. As Branson was hauled away, the atmosphere shifted. What had been chaos solidified into a single, undeniable truth. The crowd erupted, not with fear this time, but with triumph. Applause burst like fireworks, cheers ringing through the corral. "Justice!" voices screamed, "Justice!" Jack sagged slightly, shoulders trembling as he exhaled. The baton lay abandoned at his feet, a reminder of what could have been. He turned to glance at the horse behind him. Its massive body was still taut with adrenaline, but its eyes were fixed on him, not on Branson. For the first time, the beast's gaze was steady. Jack lowered his head, a tired smile ghosting his lips. "You're safe now," he whispered. At the fence, Ethan broke into sobs, his small hands covering his face. "Dad did it," he cried. "He really did." His voice cracked with relief so raw it made nearby strangers wipe their own eyes. Sarah turned toward a cluster of journalists, her expression carved from steel. "You just saw who the real monster was," she said. Her words spread instantly, repeated by broadcasters, clipped into headlines, flooding feeds across the nation. Jack stood in the dust, shaking but unbroken. As the devil horse breathed softly behind him, the world had just witnessed the truth. The corral still vibrated with aftershocks, shouts, sobs, the wild, joyous static of a town that had just watched the impossible. Then the loudspeakers crackled. A line of folding tables had been dragged onto the makeshift stage. Behind them, a panel took their seats. The mayor of Dust Creek, a county judge, two representatives from the State Livestock Bureau, a union of press observers with lanyards flapping in the wind, and the independent safety supervisor Hale himself had hired to keep things clean. Cameras panned, microphones craned forward, the crowd settling into a hush that felt ceremonial. The judge rose first, spectacles glinting. "We have reviewed the footage and testimony," he said, his voice amplified across the dust. "By the rules of the challenge, publicly offered and publicly witnessed, Mr. Jack Harlow has successfully ridden the horse." For a breathless heartbeat, the town was silent, as if even the air leaned in to make sure the words were real. Then noise detonated, cheers, whistles, hats in the air. People were on their feet, some shouting his name, others simply crying into their palms. On the VIP platform, Donovan Hale stood motionless, color draining from his face until he looked carved from salt. An aide pressed a leather folder into his hands. The county treasurer set a portable check scanner on the table. "Wire authorization," the treasurer said into a mic, $5 million per the contract. Every lens pivoted to Hale. He tried to smile, failed, and signed. The pen scratched loud enough to be picked up by a nearby boom mic. A camera operator zoomed in on the flourish of his initials on the trembling tendons in his hand. Within minutes, the still image of Hale's signature was everywhere, on news tickers and live blogs, framed by captions that needed no added drama. Jack watched it all as if from a great distance. He stood with his arms loose at his sides, dust in the seams of his jacket, the roar of celebration washing over him like surf. It wasn't triumph he felt so much as relief, something unclenching inside the chest he'd kept armored for years. When the swarm broke and reporters poured toward him, they came with multicolored microphones and questions like hailstones. "Mr. Harlow, what are you going to do with $5 million?" Jack found Ethan at the fence, red-eyed, smiling so hard it hurt his cheeks. He hugged his son, then looked at the herd of cameras. He cleared his throat. "Part of it goes to a fund," he said, his voice low but unshakable, "for veterans, and for animals like him." He nodded toward the black silhouette, moving slowly at the far rail. "The rest is for my boy." He didn't elaborate, but an hour later, under a shade canopy beside Sarah Whitman's pickup, he signed the papers. The Broken But Not Lost Foundation, dedicated to PTSD support for veterans, emergency grants for families in crisis, and rehabilitation care for abused animals. The treasurer from Casper National confirmed the first transfers. A separate college account was opened for Ethan, conservative, locked, safe. "No more wondering how we'll make the next month," Jack whispered, pressing his palm to the boy's hair. Ethan leaned into the touch like a plant to light. The town felt it too, the pivot from stunt to substance. By sunset, the same voices that had once called him reckless were repeating his words on talk radio and in diner booths. For veterans, for animals. A sentence simple enough to remember, strong enough to spread. The news did not spare Cole Branson. The footage of him with the whip, the baton, the scream, it had already burned through every feed. Now came the consequence. Hale released a statement, brief and sterile, announcing Branson's termination, effective immediately. It sounded like a tourniquet cinched over a severed limb. No ranch in 3 counties would hire the man known online as the face of cruelty. He tried to swagger into the saloon, but the room thinned around him. The same mouths that used to laugh at his jokes now tightened. His name curdled the air. When he spat at a teenager who shouted, "Leave the horse alone," a sheriff's deputy tapped him on the chest and pointed to the door. He went. For the first time in years, he carried himself like a man who finally understood everyone could see him. Sarah Whitman did not watch the online bonfire. She worked. With 2 vet techs and a farrier she trusted, she walked the stallion into the clinic pen, a larger, quieter space away from the spectacle. "Left hind," she murmured, crouching as dust settled. "Old strain, flared up again. Mouth sores along the commissures." She turned to Jack. "We'll start with the feet. Heat and cold cycles, light anti-inflammatories, time. As for the mouth, we retire metal until he heals. Soft hackamore later, maybe, or nothing at all." Jack stood on the safe side of the rail, hands linked, as if afraid any gesture could break what had been so carefully made. Sarah glanced back. "You should join the rehab program," she said. "I'm taking in 4 more cases this month. Mustangs, 2 rodeo injuries. We need another pair of eyes." "I'm no trainer," Jack answered reflexively. "You don't have to be," Sarah said, and her smile was the exact opposite of a crowd smile. Small, steady, meant only for him. "You just have to listen." He didn't trust his voice for a moment. "Okay," he said at last. "Then I'll listen." By nightfall, the headline had chosen him, "The Man Who Listened." He watched it scroll across a motel room screen while Ethan dozed against his shoulder and a tray of untouched waffles cooled on the dresser. On a panel show, one host said, "He didn't ride to win. He rode to prove the truth." Another replied, "It wasn't a conquest. It was a recognition." The hashtags rippled outward. The Man Who Listened. Broken but not lost. And for once, the noise of the world struck him not as a threat, but as a current he could float in for a while, long enough to catch his breath. He turned off the TV. In the quiet, he could hear the wind moving through the cottonwoods behind the clinic, and faintly, the patient, weighty exhale of a horse learning at last that the night would hold. Dust Creek exhaled. News vans rolled away. The bleachers came down, plank by plank. The roadside stands closed, their paper signs curling at the edges. For the first time in a week, the streets felt like themselves again. The crunch of gravel beneath a bicycle tire, the sound of a screen door, a radio murmuring weather from a kitchen window. Night softened the world. Moonlight spread over the corral like spilled milk, graying the boards, quieting the dust. Jack sat in a cracked plastic chair just beyond the fence line, his boot heel pressed into dirt, his hands folded across his stomach as if to keep himself from coming apart. Ethan slept with his head against Jack's shoulder, mouth open in the unguarded way of children. One small hand had found and clutched Jack's fingers and refused to let go, even in dreams. No crowd, no commentary, just the sigh of the high plains wind and the low, steady murmur of a horse breathing. The black stallion stepped from shadow, its shape easing into the silver light. No scream, no sudden violence. It moved as if it too felt the long day end. Dust puffed at each step. When it reached the fence, it paused, listening for coyotes far off, for the tiny rasp of cricket song, for the rhythm of the sleeping boy. Jack did not rise. He had nothing left to prove. He simply sat and waited, letting quiet do what noise never could. The stallion closed the last distance and lowered its head. The moon lit the faint map of old scars, a quilt of healed lines that did not vanish simply because no one was beating them anymore. It reached over the rail and with a gentleness that seemed impossible given all that had been done to it, touched the back of Jack's knuckles where his hand rested on his knee. Jack didn't move for a count of 5, 10, letting the contact be the whole message. Then, with the lightest pressure, he turned his palm and stroked along the jawline to the soft hollow beneath the cheek. The horse's eyelids fluttered. A long, heavy breath left its body. Not a threat, not a warning. Release. It half closed its eyes, leaning into the touch, and for the first time allowed a human hand to linger without armor or insistence. A security camera mounted under the clinic eave watched it happen without intention, just a lens catching light. By morning, the still frame would be everywhere again, the veteran in a torn jacket, the boy asleep, and the horse pressing forward like a ship into harbor. But here, now, it did not belong to the world. It belonged to the three of them. Jack bowed his head. The words came without performance, too small for microphones. We both made it back, scarred, but still here. In that sentence lived the desert and the convoy and the blast he could still smell when he woke at 2 a.m. It held Anna's last whisper in a little house with a failing roof, the denial letters from agencies that measured suffering in line items, all the nights he had sat in the dark so Ethan wouldn't see him shake. It held a horse's terror and the way terror can be taught by hands that should have done better. It held the simple, stubborn fact that survival is not the absence of wounds, but the decision to carry them forward without passing them on. The stallion's ear flicked, Jack's hand stilled. He didn't ask for more. He didn't need to. Across the yard, a tiny red light blinked on the camera. One frame every few seconds, enough to sketch a story. A weary man with watchful eyes, a sleeping child whose mouth curved mid-dream toward a smile, and an animal once mangled by spectacle, now at rest in the quiet it had been promised and denied. 3 lives yoked not by ownership, but by a thing harder to name, a thread that shook when wind moved through it and yet did not break. By noon the next day, that image had a name. Newspapers ran it above the fold with a caption that landed like a benediction: "The last picture of Dust Creek." Editorials called it a symbol of resilience and repair. Teachers taped it to classroom doors. A VA clinic framed it in the waiting room. A horse sanctuary in another state printed it on flyers to raise funds for gentler equipment. The photograph did what pictures do when they show us not argument, but possibility. A national weekly closed their cover story with a sentence the country seemed to have been waiting to hear: "There are no born monsters, only wounds men create." It flew across timelines and breakfast tables, was stitched on patches, printed on posters. It became a motto for people who worked with war, with animals, with children, and with men who had been told to stop feeling or else. Jack laughed at the grandeur of it whenever someone asked him for a quote. He did not feel grand. He felt tired and clean, the way you feel after you've said the thing that needed saying. He took Ethan to the bank to sign one last document, then to the thrift store for a better chair to replace the cracked one. That evening, he showed up at Sarah's with a thermos of coffee and a pair of work gloves. She pointed him to a bay gelding with eyes like wet stones and said, "Same plan as always. Stand near, breathe. Let him tell you something first." He did. He would keep doing it. not because cameras asked or crowds demanded, but because listening had worked once, and he intended to become the kind of man who trusted it to work again. When moonlight returned to the corral, the stallion drifted close on his own. The boy slept without flinching at thunder, and the soldier, still a father, sat where he could see them both. The wind moved through the fence slats with a sound like pages turning. Somewhere, a nightbird called, was answered, and fell quiet. They were not healed, but they were home. The road into Dust Creek no longer felt like a dusty ribbon to nowhere. 12, maybe 15 years had scrolled by since the day the country watched a broken soldier sit a broken horse, and in that time the town had learned to live with its own legend. There were new signs at the highway turnoff now, shaped like little bronzes of running mustangs. A visitor's center, modest and cedar-scented, sold coffee and maps and a paper pamphlet titled "The Day We Listened." The old diner had a framed photo above the register, Jack Harlow in a sun-bleached jacket, Ethan small and fierce at his side, and a black stallion caught mid-breath. Tourists pointed, school buses unloaded for field trips. A mural spread across the brick wall of the feed store, painted by high schoolers. No whips, no chains. Just a horse and a man in the quiet space where trust lives. Dust Creek was still small. The wind still found your bones. But the story had made it not just a dot on the map, but a point on other people's compasses. A place you could come to remember the difference between force and strength. Jack Harlow walked Main Street slower these days. He was 55, 57, depending on who you asked, and silver threaded his hair like frost on fence wire. The years had not erased the lines around his eyes, but they had gentled them. Therapy had done its work in patient layers, and the program Sarah Whitman had nudged him toward became less like court-mandated visits and more like the standing appointments a craftsman keeps with his tools. Breathing, grounding, talking when the talking hurt. He still flinched at thunder. He still woke some nights already halfway to the door. But he came back quicker. The flashbacks loosened. He could stand in a crowded grocery aisle now and only hear the clink of jars and the roll of wheels. He passed the memorial on the rise above town without needing to stop. But he often did. The black stallion was buried there, a low, grassy swell ringed with native stones. Time had taken him the slow way, stiff joints, grey eyelids, breath that came with effort until one winter night, it simply didn't. The town had gathered. Jack had kept his hand on the old horse's neck until it cooled under his palm. Someone carved a simple marker. No chains, no whips, just freedom. People left apples and smooth river pebbles on the stone, the way pilgrims leave tokens at the feet of saints. Sometimes there were dog tags coiled like small moons, left by men and women who had fought other wars under other skies. Jack stayed just long enough, then went back down the path and into the day. The wind carried a smell of alfalfa and sun-warmed dust. In the shop windows, flyers for fundraisers curled, the ink faded by light. In his pocket, the key to the little house he had rebuilt, board by board, with Ethan. He did not feel like a symbol here. He felt like a man who had work to do and dinner to cook. That evening, as the light thinned to honey, father and son sat on the porch with their feet on the railing, bottlenecks sweating rings onto the old wood. The cottonwoods along the creek trembled. Swallows stitched dark lines through the sky. Ethan was taller than Jack now, with the same stalwart set to his shoulders and the same quiet gaze. He wore the sun the way ranch kids do, across his cheeks and along his forearms, as if the day itself had brushed against him and stayed. He had graduated in the spring, not with fanfare so much as with a clarity that made fanfare unnecessary. 2 degrees, business management, and a second in animal science he had picked up because he couldn't stand to sit on one side of the fence. He'd taken a job with the county for a while, then a sanctuary out of state had recruited him. But Dust Creek kept tugging at his sleeve. He came back with a dog-eared notebook full of models and margins, and more than once with a horse trailer attached to the truck. "Dad," Ethan said into the late light, that day's notebook shut on his knee. "You don't have to keep saving for me anymore. I'm grown. It's time you did something for yourself." Jack leaned back until the chair creaked. "You telling me to buy a boat?" he asked, a half-smile in the question. "God, no," Ethan said, laughing. "You'd hate a boat." He turned the notebook in his hands and tapped the cover. "I've been thinking about something else. For us. For them." "Them who?" Jack asked, though he already suspected. "Animals like him," Ethan said, and tipped his head toward the hill where the stallion slept. "And vets like you." The idea came out in a clean line, as if it had been waiting behind his teeth. A ranch that would take in abused horses, PMU mares, retired and ruined rodeo stock with scars hidden under hair, Mustangs who had learned men meant pain, and pair their slow, patient rehabilitation with therapy for veterans living with post-traumatic stress. The broken but not lost foundation had grown beyond a single office and grant cycle. It could seed the land, pay the first hires, build something with fences and roofs instead of just spreadsheets. Ethan had visited programs in 3 states, learned what worked and what didn't. He'd drawn diagrams of paddocks and turnout schedules, cost analyses of hay shipments, a staffing plan that started with 3 people and grew to 7 by year 2. There were notes about farriers who understood trauma, counselors who used the word listen more than fix. "Not perfect horses," Ethan said. "Not perfect people. No one has to be healed to be here. That's the point." Jack stared at the sky. A western tanager clicked in the cottonwoods. The first crickets tuned their strings. "I'm too old to start something new," he said, not quite believing it, not quite disbelieving it either. "Then let me carry it with you," Ethan answered. "You showed me what survival means. Let's give that to others." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the kind of quiet that stretches over something significant, like plastic over a fresh slab of concrete. Jack felt absurdly like laughing and crying at once. He pressed his thumb into the chair arm until he found the old notch where a nail once sat. He thought of the stallion pressing into his hand in the moonlight, breath warm and trusting. He thought of nights he had sat at this same railing and told the dark, "I am still here." He thought of men he'd met in waiting rooms, of bones that remembered what blasts teach. "All right," he said at last, his voice rough. "All right, show me your notebooks." The first weeks were all paper and waiting rooms, county permits that needed 3 signatures and a meeting. Zoning maps spread across desks like treasure charts. Conversations about setbacks and water rights with men who wore bolo ties and smelled like old coffee. They found a parcel out past the cotton fields, a sloping piece of land with a knuckled hill to break the wind, and a weedy rectangle where a barn had once leaned. A woman from a family moving to town for a hospital job sold it for less than she could have gotten if she had waited. "I watched that live stream with my mother," she said, shaking Jack's hand. "It made her cry. Sometimes goodwill is worth more than cash." The foundation covered the purchase. The rest came from people Jack would never meet. Small checks in envelopes, wires from strangers with subject lines like, "For the horse who saved me." A retired Marine sent fence posts. A church group showed up with sandwiches and a tool belt that had a patch sewn to the strap. "Listen." They built enclosures as if assembling a sentence, one corral then the next, connected by gates that swung without a squeal. Sarah loaned her clinic trailer and most of her Saturdays. She arrived with clipboards, a straw hat, and a talent for telling hard truths kindly. "Shade first," she said, drawing rectangles with her finger, "then water, then shelter. We can fix training mistakes later. We can't fix heat stroke." The days left their marks. Jack woke early to beat the sun, carried posts until his shoulders remembered soldiering, measured twice and cut once, then measured again just to be sure. Paperwork dogged them, inspections that were rescheduled because a man's daughter got sick, an HVAC unit that failed 48 hours after they plugged it in. Money ran thinner than the spreadsheets liked. Ethan took a consulting gig by day and hammered by headlamp at night. Sometimes they snapped at each other like men too tired to be careful with their voices. Sometimes they passed a bottle back and forth in the dust and said nothing at all. What was different, what lodged deep in Jack's chest like a splinter of light, was that this time he wasn't alone on any slope. When the permit office made them wait, 2 young vets who had heard about the project showed up with lawn chairs and told stories that made the waiting not feel like punishment. When the concrete truck got stuck on the access road, the neighbors appeared with chains and a tractor older than both of them. When his hands shook, no one told him to stop. Ethan simply took the drill, finished the run of screws, and handed it back without commentary. The first rescues arrived on a Wednesday, with the sky rinsed clean by a squall. They came 2 trailers at a time, FEMA tags from one state, a sheriff's signature from another, a bay mare with ribs like pickets, and a ragged brand half hidden under scar tissue, a sway-backed gelding with a mouth that flinched from bits you couldn't see, 2 half-wild mustangs from a rushed roundup who watched every hand as if it might turn to a snake. Their fear was not a thing you could talk out of them. It was a physics. Step too fast and their eyes rolled. Lift your arm too high and their feet left the ground. Slower, Sarah said, the way she'd said it a decade and a half earlier. So slow it feels like you're not moving. And when they tell you to back off, you listen. They did. The first week was nothing but routine. Hay at the same time each morning, water buckets scrubbed until sunlight shone from the rims, the soft scrape of a broom across rubber mats. No halters, no ropes. The vets who came, men and women with tattoos and quiet smiles, sat on overturned buckets and breathed. They learned where horses carry their worry, in a flicking ear, a chewing jaw, a tail that swishes once and then holds very still. They learned that the body has 1,000 ways to tell the truth. They learned to stop interrupting. Jack found a rhythm he hadn't known he was built for. Measure out pellets, count heartbeats. Stand still while a scarred nose reached forward, then stepped back, then reached forward again. He watched a corporal with a tremor in his left hand learn to hold it steady long enough for a bay mare to smell his knuckles. He watched a woman who hadn't slept through the night in years lean her back against a fence post and drift off for 18 minutes. Because the sound of horses munching hay is the sound of the earth deciding for a little while not to be cruel. There were bad days, of course there were. A mustang blew through a gate, and they spent an hour circling him back to the chute with gently lifted arms. A farrier took a hoof too quick, and the gelding flinched so hard he caught the man across the thigh with his knee. The clinic scale broke. A donor check bounced. Jack found himself one afternoon sitting on a stack of hay bales with both hands fisted in his hair, breath coming fast in the old thin way. Ethan sat beside him. He didn't touch his father's back. He didn't offer a solution. He simply put his boots on the bale and matched Jack's inhale, matched his exhale until the panic loosened its teeth and sheepishly wandered off to stand somewhere else. "Still with me?" Ethan said. Jack nodded. "Still with you." By fall, the ranch had a name, the listening field, and a hand-painted sign that made Jack's chest ache the first 20 times he drove past it. Word spread in the quiet ways that matter, in church bulletins, in VA group texts, in the bottom corners of TAC catalogues. People began to arrive with more stories than luggage. Some stayed a week. Some came every Thursday for months. The rule was the same for all of them. You didn't have to say what had happened. You could, if saying it out loud made it less heavy. But you could also stand with a horse and let your hands be the only language you needed to speak. One evening, winter leaned its shoulder against the hills and then thought better of it. The sky went lilac, then bruise blue, and the pasture drank the light until it shone from within. They had opened the last gate that afternoon, giving the newest arrivals access to the larger field. For days they had watched the horses choose the fence line, the safe corner, the measured walk. That night something changed. Not anything you could point to on a schedule, but something like a sigh passing through the herd. The bay mare picked up a trot. The sway-backed gelding lifted his head and followed. The mustangs, all bone and hesitance, flicked their ears toward one another as if listening for permission, and found it in the ground. They went, a canter first, awkward with a memory of hurt, then a run that smoothed as air combed their manes. Their shadows poured long across the grass. Their legs wrote the old calligraphy of movement. Jack stood at the fence, the same place he had stood for so many beginnings, his hands on the top rail, hat brim pushed back. Ethan stepped up beside him. The herd streamed past them, and an old joy lit Jack's face in a way that had nothing to do with being seen and everything to do with seeing. "This is home, Dad," Ethan said. "For them. For us." Jack's mouth softened. He kept his eyes on the horses. "No chains," he said, the words the softest vow he knew. "No whips, just freedom." The camera on the barn corner caught them as silhouettes. The two men, the running herd, the open gate, but no one saved it to upload. Not that night. The story didn't need to leave the field to be true. It could live here for a while, where boots creak and hay dust floats and a horse covers the last yard between the life it survived and the life it wants. A week later, a film crew asked to visit, and they said yes, and the world got a glimpse of the next chapter. A ranch where broken didn't mean finished. A therapy session conducted with sugar cubes as punctuation. A man and his son who had learned that rescue is not a single moment, but a habit you practice, small and daily. The narration closed the piece the way a prayer closes a service, not as an ending, but ascending. This story doesn't end with the devil horse, the voice said. It opens onto a road where healing travels in both directions, horse to human, human to horse, and where what one generation learns about gentleness becomes the inheritance of the next. Dust Creek settled back into itself. Calves bawled, a screen door banged. Somewhere, a trumpet of geese stitched a V against the evening. On the hill, the stallion's marker watched without watching. Down below, a bay mare decided she could sleep with her head facing the wide place instead of the corner. A veteran folded his camp chair, surprised to find his shoulders lower than when he sat down. Ethan closed the pasture gate. Jack turned off the barn light. Night rose like water and held them all. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out. Hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us.